Hello, everyone, and warmly welcome to this webinar, Beyond the Unaffordability Myth. It's a launch seminar. My name is Gunnel Axelsson, Nycander, and I'm a policy advisor at Church of Sweden, and I will guide you through this session. So in this webinar, we will launch a new paper from Development Pathways and Church of Sweden, exploring how universal social security can be both affordable and achievable for low as well as middle-income countries. Building on previous research, the paper presents an alternative approach to estimating costs grounded in real-world benefit levels rather than poverty lines. We will also feature a new interactive costing tool developed to help users explore the financial feasibility of expanding social security coverage under different scenarios. So together, the study and the tool offer a pragmatic and rights-based vision, investing in universal social security as a pathway to stronger social contracts and sustainable development. First, we have some practical information. There will be time for Q&A after the presentation and comments, but you're also welcome to put questions in the Q&A box. So not the ordinary chat. In the chat box, you can make other comments and maybe announcements and so forth. I know that Stephen is usually very quick to respond in the Q&A box, but you can also raise your hand in the Q&A part of the final part of this session. And then a few words on the speakers. No, this is just the outline, where you can see that there will be time for questions, about 30 minutes, we believe. And then let's see the speakers. I will present them later more in detail, but first we have Stephen Kidd from Development Pathways, who will present the report. He's the main author. And then Danisha Raj will guide you through the online tool. We will then have comments from Luis Vieira from the Bretton Woods Project, and also from a more national perspective from Firas Sakraoui, who is from the Tunisian organization Al-Bazwa. And please let me now just give you a short introduction to the discussion and background to why we find this topic so important. As you know, I will just remind you that social security, or social protection as often called, is a human right and a key strategy for fulfilling other human rights, as well as a critical investment in human and economic development. Universal social protection is also a widely recognized goal. It was recently reiterated at the Second World Social Summit in Doha, as you can see on the screen. Still, looking at the reality, we see that most social protection programs in low and middle income countries, especially if they're financially supported by international partners, are restricted to the so-called poor and vulnerable, or poorest and most vulnerable. That means poverty-targeted safety nets, which is very different from universality and rights-based schemes. The motivation for this is mostly spelled costs. Universal benefits are simply too costly, it is assumed, and is as illustrated by this quote from the World Bank strategic document published a few years ago, where it says, while strategic priorities for moving towards universal social protection abound, creating the necessary fiscal space for doing so will remain a sine qua non for achieving progress. So it's really the key issue. And there are different ideas about, well, how costly will it be? And we know that numbers are powerful. But we also know that estimating cost is not an exact science. Depending on the methodology and the assumptions you make, you can actually make numbers say mostly anything. And in this paper, we build on the methodology used in a report launched 2 years ago in 2023, where we presented calculations for 4 low and middle income countries. So the key methodological difference compared to other cost estimates is how we set the transfer values. How many rupees, shillings, or pesos would people receive in, for example, old age pensions or child benefits? Others have used poverty lines, internationally or nationally decided, to set the transfer levels, which is quite a complicated exercise. In this study, we are very pragmatic and seek to answer another question. What would it cost for countries that have not yet introduced universal benefits to do so at levels similar to those that are in fact implemented elsewhere? Before letting Stephen dig into the report and explain the methodology in detail, I would like you as participants to respond to 2 questions. So please answer the polls that will appear on your screen. First, what do you believe the financing gap is for achieving universal social protection in low-income countries? And expressed as a percentage of GDP. Maybe, okay, people are still voting, I get. Can we close it now? In a few seconds, right? So, and the second question, right, here we can see the result. Quite even, 2 to 5% is most likely, most people believe. Thank you. And now the next question is actually the same, but not for low-income countries, but for middle-income countries this time. So please respond to that question as well. Let's soon see what the result is from that. Right, more firm respond on the 2 to 5% on that. Interesting. And we'll see if people are, what you think after having heard the presentation. So having done this pre-stuff, let me now introduce our main speakers and main author of the report. Dr. Stephen Kidd is a Principal Social Security Specialist at Development Pathways, actually founder of Development Pathways. He was previously Director of Policy at HelpAge International, led the UK Development Ministry's social protection team, among other things. And he has a wide experience across many aspects of social protection, has supported national social protection policy development in various countries, and undertaken research in a range of topics. So, Stephen, please, you have the floor.
Right. Thank you very much. I hope everybody can see the screen and hear me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you and to present our paper, which is really, trying to sort of challenge the myth that universal social protection is, unaffordable and unachievable. And to show that no, that's the case. We can, most countries can build universal social security. With their own resources and without the need of outside support. So let's get into the paper. So as we'll all know, there's significant gaps in global social security coverage. This is just shown from ILO data, the sort of gaps globally around different life cycle categories of the population. But the gaps are largest in lower middle income countries, where we find a gap of 21 of coverage only 21%. And it's a mere 7% coverage in low income countries. So coverage is very, very low, and there's a significant challenge to increase coverage in across all of these countries. But we're consistently told that building universal social security systems is unaffordable. If I was, given a penny for every time I'd heard there's no fiscal space, I'd be a very rich man by now. Unfortunately, the ILO last year put out a paper claiming it would cost 19.8% of GDP to provide universal social security in low-income countries, which I think left everybody thinking, well, the case is hopeless. Then how on earth are we going to cover a gap like that? And this has resulted in very pessimistic sort of global targets. So the USB 2030 Alliance, despite its name, which is meant to be getting universal social protection by 2030, is talking about an annual increase of at least just 2 percentage points in the share of the population. So in a country like that has no child benefit, we're talking about another 50 years to get universal coverage of child benefits. So perhaps the name should be better, USB 2080, given the sort of a pessimism behind that. And the challenge is that many countries have got social security systems. They exclude a high proportion of people. If we look here at a sort of stylistic graph, looking from the poorest to the richest on the left, we have many countries just deliver poor relief, very sort of old-fashioned type programs for the poor, conditional cash transfers, that kind of thing, public works. Some contributory schemes for those in the formal economy, but we have this big gap in the middle, which often called the missing middle, as you'll all know. And of course, in many countries, it's even worse than that. There's nothing in place. The gap's the majority of the population. All we have are public service and military pensions, if that. So, there's a big challenge in many countries. And of course, for those that have adopted the poor relief approach, just targeting the poor, of course, then they end up missing out on the majority of the poorest. We did a paper a few years ago with the Church of Sweden also, in which we looked at the exclusion areas of poverty or poor relief programs around the world, many promoted strongly by donors. And we see that in most countries, areas, the exclusion of the poorest who should be in the program is above 50%. So following this approach, we don't even reach the majority of the poorest. So it's a mass failure that we have in that these poverty targeted programs just don't even achieve what they're set out to do, which is to support the poorest members of society. And importantly, poor relief benefits are never popular. If we take very idealistically from the poorest to the richest, the amount of tax that people might pay in a country, including things like sales taxes, and you provide, a benefit in orange to just a small benefit to the poorest on the left, and this is the amount they receive. Well, of course, most taxpayers are going to be excluded. They're not going to be happy because their taxes are being paid. They're paying their taxes, but they're not receiving the benefits. It's going to the poorest. And as we've shown in other papers with the Church of Sweden, poverty benefits then or the poor relief benefits end up undermining trust in the state and the national social contract, which is the last thing we want to do. We want to build a strong social contract, but the design of the system necessarily undermines the social contract and makes people reluctant to pay taxes, which means states never have the funds to be able to pay for expanding social security systems. So in this study, we've looked at a financing gap for building key components of a social protection floor. As we see, the social protection floor is designed to address the life cycle risks that we all face. So it would provide things like every child should have a cash benefit, a child benefit, child disability benefits, a range of benefits of those of working age, from employment, sickness, maternity, disability, caregivers allowances, and then everybody should be guaranteed an old age pension. And of course, there's always room for poor relief, sort of household poverty benefits for those falling through the cracks there, but it should never be the main part of investment in countries. It only should be a small part. Most of the investment in countries should be on the life cycle benefits, largely provided on a universal basis. So in our paper, we've costed out 6 benefits, core benefits, the ones that are going to be the highest spending. That's a child benefit, disability benefits for both children and adults, so that we combine them in the costings, a maternity benefit, caregivers allowance, and an old age pension. So it's those benefits we cost out to see, well, how much it's going to cost to provide these to everybody in society that requires them. We always hear it's about when, it's when people need them, but the only way that we can guarantee that people get benefits when they need them is to provide them to everybody on a universal basis. So this is the kind of system that we're, looking at designing one or establishing in countries, a sort of multi-tiered system where the tax finance benefit goes to everybody. It's not withdrawn from those who are paying the mandatory contributory schemes. We just build the mandatory contributory schemes on top of that. So we ensure that all taxpayers benefit from their taxes. But we're costed out the tier 1 benefit, which is financed from general government finances. Now, the logic of a life cycle system is that it adjusts to the vulnerability of different households. So here we have 4 different households, and if we were to assume, say, notionally benefits of a child benefit $25, old age disability and caregivers benefits of $100, maternity benefit of $150, what we find is that, say, the house on the left, well, that's not eligible for any of these benefits. But of course, it's just a young couple. They should be, we should be supporting them with giving them jobs and training, etc. And government should be funding some of the jobs that it should require. If that couple when they have children, they can get 2 child benefits. So it's $50 they would get a month. But in a more complex household, where we have sort of, a new mother, we have an old age pensioner, well, we're looking at $300. It's a more vulnerable household, and a particularly vulnerable household like the one on the right could receive a range of different benefits from child benefits, disability, old age, caregivers, and $475 a month. So we've the life cycle system orients towards supporting the most vulnerable households in a sort of very natural way. Of course, benefits don't go to the head of the household, which is one of the problems with poor relief benefits, but are given to each of the individuals themselves, or the mother will receive the child benefit. And that's the logic of a life cycle system, is addressing vulnerabilities of households in this way. Now, in our study, there's a range of different options, for setting costs, I should say. So what we've done is in this study is that we've looked at, for comparative purposes across countries, setting some standard, and that is a standard where we've looked at the median value of similar benefits globally, and used that as calculating it as a percentage of GDP per capita. So it links to what countries can afford. So, for example, comprehensive old age pensions, looking across low and middle income countries, and the sort of percentage of GDP per capita that we see around the median values around 15.5% of GDP per capita. Some countries less, some countries are spending more, which is great, but that's the median value. So we'll say, well, that seems a reasonable, target for countries, but as I said, it takes into account the capacity of countries to finance the benefits without relying on external donors to do it. So in the study, therefore, for the different benefits, for the old age, disability, and caregivers benefits, we've said 15% of GDP per capita. For the maternity benefit, we've made it more generous at 30% of GDP per capita, and a child benefit of 4% of GDP per capita. Now, to set that in a sort of real context, what does it mean in actual values? We put that all into the report for each country, not just nominal US dollars, but also in purchasing power parity dollars. But just to take some examples of existing schemes in different countries, you can see here what our proposed transfer value is in the column in the middle, and the actual current transfer value in some countries. And you can see in a range of cases, we're actually suggesting significantly higher benefits. So, for example, in China, we're saying, look, let's have a old age pension of $171, not the current value of just a mere $25 a month. Or in Kenya, we're suggesting about $31 a month compared to the sort of $15 that is currently provided. So in some cases, it's much more generous than is provided. But as I showed, as we take the median value, of course, in some countries, it's lower than what some countries are already providing. And we're not saying that these are values that countries should provide, but we're saying this should be a reasonable minimum that all countries should be able to go for. And then looking at the sort of coverage, who are we saying should be covered by the benefits? If you look on the right-hand column, we say for the old age pension, perhaps everybody over 65. For disability benefits, an average of around 1% of all children and 3% of working age adults, in line with coverage of good benefits, similar benefits in low and middle income countries. For the caregivers benefits, we're saying, look, all caregivers who've had to perhaps give up most of their work, they should be provided with support. Maternity benefit is not just for those in work, it's for all women who give birth in a country, whether or not they're in employment. And we said for 4 months that they would get that, to really help get the all children to a good start. And of course, the child benefit on top of that, which would be ultimately for all children 0 to 17 years. And so that's the kind of coverage that we're aiming for in the system. So pretty broad and optimistic coverage. In our costings, we also deduct the current costs of equivalent life cycle benefits in each country. So we take into account what countries are already spending on similar benefits. And so the paper includes a comprehensive list of current spending and life cycle benefits in each country. We don't include poor relief benefits in the data that we have there, just the life cycle benefits that we're costing out, showing what countries are currently spending. And there's a total of 118 countries in the study. And as you've heard, we have a costings tool behind it so people can do their own costs, and therefore you can vary the transfer values and the coverage also. So let's look at, what if we were to introduce this kind of system that we just described immediately, overnight, say next year for 2026? What would it cost? These are the costs in each region of the world that we did the study in. And so the cumulative average gap is around 2.69% of GDP. That's somewhat lower than the ILO calculated last year. They were just about 3.3% of GDP, but that's sort of the cumulative average gap that we have. In low income countries, we've calculated out, if it was introduced in 2026, almost 3% of GDP for low income countries. This compares to the ILO's calculated gap of almost 20% of GDP, which we've written papers on to show where there were challenges with the ILO's methodology and coming up to such a high cost. So, for each country, we also give in the paper, so the costs for each paper, if it was introduced immediately in 2026. So you can see here, I know it's very, very small. It's easier to read in the paper. But what we show is the highest gap would be in Sri Lanka, which has quite an aging population, just above 3% of GDP. And the lowest gap is in Mongolia. Let's say Mongolia, the star of the show, because it has a very, very extensive system of universal benefits already in place, probably a model for the rest of the world to follow, and has a very small coverage gap. Just want to point out on one, which affects the global figures of costing, of course, is China. In our paper, we find a gap, if it was introduced immediately, of just over 3% of GDP, while the ILO suggested a mere 0.2% of GDP, which is why their figures were quite low, given that they'd said 19.8% of GDP in countries. And that's because the ILO used tiny, tiny transfer values, where we have used what we regard as much more reasonable transfer values, as I mentioned before, for China. However, introduced, even at these costs, introducing universal systems overnight is just too expensive. in most countries. Most can't afford 2.5, 3% of GDP overnight. So we have to be realistic. And we have to realize, of course, high income countries introduced their systems over time, gradually. They grew over time. So should we expect exactly the same in low and middle income countries? And so what we looked at in a study rather is a more realistic, we're not saying it's absolutely realistic, but a more realistic um, scenario in which schemes are introduced over a longer period, perhaps over 20 years, with growing gradually year by year. And that's the main sort of purpose of the paper, is to see how we could do that year on year. So the principles of the costing scenarios for this gradual expansion over about 20 years are, as I said, we look at the median value of similar benefits. We stay with that, but we also gradually bring in different schemes, one scheme per year, starting with old age pensions, and bringing in different schemes one per year from 2026 to 2030. We index the schemes to inflation, so that they can retain their purchasing power over time. So that often doesn't happen in the real world. And we assume a rate of economic growth for each country predicted by the IMF in 5 years' time. And we assume that goes on into the future. Nobody can know. It might be better or worse in countries. Nobody can know that. But this is what we predict, relying on the IMF's, hopefully good judgment of what will happen in the future. And as I said before, we account for current expenditures to estimate the financing gap. So we calculate the total cost and then deduct the current expenditures. And we use three different demographic scenarios, recognizing that some countries have very young populations, some have much older populations. So younger population countries, one scenario, that's countries which have 0 to 17s or are over 40% of the population. Medium population countries, it's where the proportion of children 0 to 17 is less than 40%, and the proportion of older people over 65 is also less than 10%. And then aging population countries are the share of the older population comprising more than 10% of the total population. And we set different scenarios for each of these categories. And so, and we then sort of grow over time as we start the schemes. And this sets out briefly what we do without all the detail that you can find in the paper. So old age pension, we start with a higher age of eligibility and reduce it over time to 65 years, and start with a somewhat lower benefit and increase it over time to 15% of GDP per capita, but in 2025 values. Disability benefits, again, is a gradual increase in coverage to the 1% of children and 3% of working age adults. But the caregivers and maternity benefits, we just have a fixed scenario for those, so all caregivers and all new mothers in each country with the transfer values that we'd mentioned before. And then with the child benefit, we start with young children and gradually increase to all 0 to 17s. With the transfer value remaining at 4% of GDP per capita throughout. So for the child benefit, for example, this is how it's set up. We would start perhaps in 2028 in the models. For the young population countries, start for 0 to 1-year-olds, and we just don't take any child off the child benefit until they reach the age of 18, and then they're removed. So that by 2037, we'd be reaching all 0 to 10-year-olds, and 2044, that's when we'd have a universal system for all children 0 to 17. For the other age category countries, for those with medium population, we start at 0 to 4 for all children, and in those with aging population, 0 to 6 years. In the tool, you can vary all of this for yourselves if you want to make your own costings, which could be very different to those that we've had. And we set out in the table, I don't want to go through this, for each scenario in much more in detail what we've actually done. So you can look at that and critique that. And then, of course, set up your own scenarios on the costings tool. So what does this actually do then if we look at it building this gradually over time? This is the cost of the cumulative sort of or aggregate financing gap that would have to be filled across all countries in the study, all 118 countries. What it shows is that in 2026, the gap is only 0.2% of GDP. Pretty small, pretty affordable if there's the political will there to do it, doesn't need donor financing. And the highest gap is just less than 2% of GDP. The cumulative average over that, again, that's not very high. But the important thing is that we get to that over time. So it would require a gradual expansion of only 0.12% of GDP per year. Again, very, very affordable, which could come out in most countries out of the proceeds of new tax that comes out of economic growth in many countries. So if there's a political will, this is all that would be required to build a universal system. After about 2041, the costs begin to go down because on aggregate, it's predicted that economic growth is going higher than the population growth. And let's remember, many countries are already spending much more than this. Nepal, for example, already spends more on similar schemes than the 1.98% that we have here. Nepal being quite a poor country, again, a model for other countries to follow. So it doesn't require to be rich. You can still be a poor country like Nepal and still reach this amount. And we have some countries, Nepal, Timor-Leste, etc., which are very good examples of poorer countries that have done this. If we look at costs across different groupings of countries, let's look at lower middle and upper middle income countries. For low income countries, this is the scenario that we would see each year in terms of the growth as a percentage of GDP. And so the maximum average cumulative financing gap would be around 1.56% of GDP. Very, very low. That would be able to get to in a few years. So much low, less than 1/10 of what the ILO was predicting, which caused everybody to give up hope. We're saying, no, there is hope. It's very small. It can be done gradually at this amount. On lower middle income countries, follows the orange trajectory. And we find the highest costs to come in the upper middle income countries, largely because of China. They're at just above 2% of GDP to introduce it by 2042 before costs begin to drop. So it's still pretty low. Even there, still not as much as Nepal is spending. We also show the financing gap for each country. We have this graph in where we show the gap in 2026, 2035, and 2044 for each country. We have annual data in an annex for each country and how it would grow gradually. And so you can see the blue in most countries, very, very small. That's to introduce it next year. Still in most countries, very low cost. In green by 2024, we're sort of expanding out to some of the higher costs. So the highest cost would be in 2024, by 2024 would be in Mauritania and Tunisia at 3.4% of GDP. Still quite high cost, but let's remember we got 20 years to get there. So still relatively low costs year on year, but very low costs in some countries such as Georgia, Mauritius, Mongolia, Nepal, Philippines, South Africa, which already have quite good systems in place or enjoying very high economic growth. And some low-income countries costs are actually less than 1.5% of GDP, such as Ethiopia, Liberia, South Sudan, Uganda, for example. So there is hope in all of these countries if policymakers are willing to set off in the right direction. The important thing to remember in all of this is that while poor relief will not lead to an expansion because of its lack of popularity and lack of willingness of people to pay their taxes. If, however, going back to the diagram we had before, we were given a flat rate benefit on a universal basis to everybody, to all taxpayers, we change the political dynamics within a country because benefits go to everyone. So everybody's more likely to be happy. They're going to be more willing to pay their taxes. And so we can build this kind of virtuous cycle in which people are more willing to pay taxes and therefore countries are more able to find the funds to pay for universal systems. And as a result, we build trust in the state, which is critically important rather than undermining trust as we're doing with poor relief benefits, and a stronger social contract, which is one of the big prizes that we'd hope to achieve. So in 20 years, all countries could be reaching most of the population with life cycle benefits, and over 90% of households would be receiving benefits. So just to finish, I've been working in this area for Social Security for over 20 years. I just been thinking, just written a blog about this, which you can find, what if we'd started building universal social security systems 20 years ago? What if we didn't get into the ideological battles where people were pushing for low spending, low taxes, poverty benefits? What if we started doing this 20 years ago? We'd have universal systems in place by now. But there was an ideological war that's been going on, of those who are pushing for poor relief benefits, which have led to failure over the last 2 decades. So let's not make the same mistake. Let's encourage countries and get the message out there that if it's possible to build universal social security systems, it's about making the right policy choices for your population. It's possible to get there. It may take a bit of time, but let's make certain that in 20 years' time, we're not looking back again and saying, God, what if we'd started in 2026? We would have had a universal system. Let's not make that mistake, and let's encourage all countries to do that. So I'll finish now and hand back to Gunnel.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for this comprehensive walk through the paper. And just a short question to you. You have, as you mentioned, been working for a long time on this. Development Pathways had made many calculations, and you have this wealth also of data that made it possible for me. But this is the first time that you have looked at all low and middle income countries in such a comprehensive. Is there anything that made you surprised in this exercise?
Well, I think not so much surprise, but I think in some countries, where we don't have good coverage, for example, like the Philippines, that it is actually surprisingly low cost in a country where you have good economic growth. So there are some countries which are surprisingly low. I think some low income countries, it really is quite low cost if you want to have a minimum benefit. So it's not a massive surprise. We've been doing this a lot around the world. We've been proposing this. What I would say is that we're not saying this is our proposal for each country. When we work in each country, we'd have much more tailored to the situation of each country. But I think the important thing is to show it's feasible. We need to get away from this myth that there is no fiscal space. There is.
Thank you. And talking about tailoring, we are now soon coming to the costing tool that we are also presenting today. So Danisha Raj, who will help us, she is a colleague of Stephen at Development Pathways and a social protection officer at Development Pathways with experience in research on social protection policy across a number of countries like India, Angola, and Jordan. And she has a background in international development and applied development economics from London School of Economics. So please, Danisha, help us to understand the tool.
Thanks, Gunnel. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly share my screen. But one thing to say is our colleague, Telawan, co-author of this paper, who really has put in most of his time and resources into making the tool what it is today, is unfortunately not able to join us. And so I'm lucky enough to present the tool to you all and seem like I can take credit for it. So I'm really excited about that. So what I wanted to do is start from, the Development Pathways website. So this is just a landing page for the website. I want to show, how you can find the tool from there, and then we can go into the tool. So from the main website, if you click on this resources tab here, you can then go to the social protection financing gap tool. It says that quite clearly there. So once you click on it, it'll take you to the landing page for the tool. So the social protection financing gap tool landing page has a bit of background information, including a link that shows the study that Stephen has just presented on, and you can separately go to that. But over here, you can see the link to access the tool. So once you click on that, it will take you into the tool. It'll open a separate tab automatically, and you will then be able to access the tool. So this now is the landing page for the tool itself. We do have a set of instructions for reference over there on the tool. So every time you open the tool, you can have a little refresher on the instructions. But also, there's a helpful setup bar on the left side of the screen here that takes you step by step on going through each of the parameters before it goes into developing the costings. So let's just quickly go through the setup step by step, and then we can see the results page and how the results are presented in the tool. So just like Gunnel said, right, depending on the methodology and assumptions, you can really make the numbers say anything you want. And so that's why we really wanted to make this as user-friendly as possible, as flexible as possible, so that people can have a play around with it and develop, more context-specific costings. But also, so in step 1, you can select your countries. So you can filter either by 2 classifications, country demographic group, which follow the 3 classifications we have created for the paper, so young, middle, aging, or you can filter by country income group, or indeed select individual countries themselves. So this has a list of all 118 countries that are included in the study, and you can select as many as you want. So currently we have every country selected, and for the purposes of just demonstrating the tool, I'm just going to leave these as is. But yeah, obviously when you are playing around with the tool, you can filter by either demographic group or income group, or select the countries you want. Then it goes on to the years. So years for output. The first bar here shows the year for the results that you're interested in. So given that it's 2026, basically tomorrow, let's move on. Let's say I want to see outputs for the years 2027 to 2040. And so I can just change the scroll bar over here if I want to extend it. So right now, let's leave it at 2040 for this exercise. And then similarly, you can select program start years for each of the benefits. So 6 in total, but we've combined the child and adult disability benefits into one. So there are 5 over here, and you can choose the starting year. So because we've set 2027 for the output years, let's just change our program start years individually here. So this allows for flexibility in maybe starting different programs at different years. It really is quite flexible. So if you want to say focus on building a comprehensive child benefit system in a country and put maternity benefits in later, you can just change the years here, and that will automatically be taken into account when the results are developed. Our third step is setting the transfer values. So currently the tool has some defaults in, most of them are aligned with the medians that we proposed, or in the case of maternity benefits, it's 30%, just like we've done in the paper, slightly higher for child benefits, 5%. But again, these are just default values in the tool. You are free to change them to whatever you want when you're having a play around based on, what you're trying to gain out of the tool, what kind of scenarios are you looking at, what countries are you looking at. So for now, we'll just leave the default amounts, but yeah, just so you know, there is variability in every benefit option for you to select a transfer amount. And then finally, there are additional parameters, and this is absolutely optional, but as we know that the assumptions we choose that undermine our costings will then obviously reflect the numbers that we get. So we've allowed for users to change the assumptions that undermine each benefit here. So the assumption for maternity benefit, for instance, would be the prevalence of twins, or for child benefits, it's the year that the benefit starts. So what we've done here is we've, again, using the 3 demographic classifications, we've allowed users to select different starting ages that will then slowly increase one by one each year until all children under 0 to 17 are reached. So in this case, the default in the tool, for instance, says that in young countries, we'll start by providing the benefit for all children 0 to 5 years, and then year on year, it'll increase by 1 until reaching all children 0 to 17. And we made similar assumptions for the old age benefit. But again, these are variable. So if I wanted to say start the old age pension at 65 for all countries in the very first year, I can just bring all of these back to 65. And that changes our assumptions and so our costings. So yeah, I encourage everyone to have a look at the tool for themselves, have a play around, read through all of the assumptions, have a play with changing them around. I don't want to go through each and every one of them here, but just wanted to show you that we do allow enough flexibility in each of the assumptions, including economic projections, so that users are able to develop the costings that they would find most interesting. So once you click on proceed to costings, it takes you to this results page. And obviously sometimes it takes a second. In this case, because we selected all 118 countries, it took 1 second, but sometimes even less than that, depending on the number of countries. So our results tab is divided into three key outputs, our beneficiaries, our total budget, and a financing gap. So under the beneficiaries, you can see year on year the beneficiaries for each country and each program listed over here in the tables below. But also we have helpful visualizations on top. And the interesting part about the tool is that you can also select the countries of interest you want to see in the visualizations yourself. So let's say I'm only interested at looking at Angola. I can select just Angola, and I can choose whether or not to have a weighted average of all countries. So let's say we remove that. Here I have graphs showing just the number of beneficiaries year on year for each benefit type in Angola, including the total. And I'm allowed to download these as well. So I can download the charts, or if I scroll down, I can download the individual data for the number of beneficiaries. And it follows a similar design in the other two tabs. So if you click on total budget, you'll see the tab that shows you the total budget year on year for each country under each benefit, again, with helpful visualizations on top. And you can customize, which countries you want to see in the graphs, or if you just want to see the totals, you can include just the total weighted averages, and it'll show you just that to download or to have a play around. And of course, then we have the financing gap, which in the first column over here under current budget, lists the current budget that we have found based on our extensive study of countries, and then presents the financing gap year on year, which technically is just the deduction of the current budget from the total budget. And again, follows a similar structure in terms of presentation, the graphs on top, and the data below. So this is how the tool looks and works, and I hope everyone finds it as interesting to play with it as I did when we were writing up this paper. And finally, our third and final tab on the tool, the information tab, has all of the notes and sources, including the notes for all of the country level expenditures and our short note on privacy and cookies. So yeah, that's about the tool. And I hope everyone finds it as interesting to play around with as I did. And yeah, we've allowed for as much customization as possible. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Danisha. And I'm sure everyone is as excited as you and myself. And maybe I should ask everyone not to go into the tool now, but stay in the session and listen to the rest of the comments. So I will now invite comments on the report and the tool. And first, we will hear comments from Luis Vieira. Luis is coordinator of the Bretton Woods Project, which is a civil society watchdog of the IMF and World Bank based in London. Among other things, Luis has previously served as a chief of mission for the International Organization of Migration in Timor-Leste and also worked for the NGO Mercy Corps. And has a background in international law and development economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at University of London. So based on your experience on debates on international development finance, what's your thoughts and reactions to the report? Please, Luis.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I've been having a bit of problem with my sound system, my computer, so I'll take the
better now.
I'll make my comments from my phone if that's okay. I hope you can hear me okay.
Now it's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to first of all congratulate the authors of the report. I think this is really an excellent and timely report. As I think most of you know, involved in the call, the community of actors advocating for universal social protection has really faced quite severe resistance over the years from policy setting bodies such as including the IMF and the World Bank. I think some people might say, well, maybe human rights is an area in which we shouldn't opt for pragmatism of approaches. But, I commend the report's authors for really focusing on this idea of progressive realization of human rights. So I'm very happy to see that the approach taken is indeed consistent with human rights principles and norms, towards the progressive achievement of universal human rights. So I think that's great. And as Stephen and Gunnel also noted, it's great to see that while the pragmatic approach is to begin slowly, that they really encourage states to, of course, roll out and meet their objectives within the shortest time frame possible, which is great. In terms of the relationship with the IMF and the World Bank, I think this report really makes an extremely important contribution, because as I think most of you are aware, we're living through a very, very difficult and challenging economic and geopolitical situation in which we're facing a decrease in overseas development assistance. We have we're in the midst of what many consider a debt crisis, and we have impediments to trade and et cetera. So countries are facing very, very significant fiscal constraints. And in that regard, unfortunately, the importance of the IMF and the World Bank and their influence in dealing with member states has increased significantly, particularly after COVID-19, but it's likely to continue to increase and expand in the foreseeable future. Similarly, I think if you look at the UN reform process, we're looking at a situation in which the power of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and IMF, is likely to increase rather than decrease. So our ability to engage in substantive discussions and convince both the IMF and the World Bank to support local efforts towards universal social protection is extremely important. I acknowledge that when we have these discussions, many people tell us that maybe don't follow the bank and the fund very closely at the program country level, that their rhetoric has changed, and haven't they changed from their focus on austerity, etc. The reality is that if you do analysis at the country level, which, for example, Isabel Ortiz and others have done, you see, and the Bretton Woods Project has a tool called the Article 4 scanner, which allows people to search and do research on Article 4 reports that the IMF conducts, which are these visits that they conduct yearly to countries. You see that really at the country level, the reliance on austerity, fiscal consolidation, et cetera, is still very much present. So, this really centers the discussion around the affordability gap, because that's where the opposition from the bank and the fund really lies. And I think it's great to have this report, particularly to respond to the Frederick Eberstein Foundation ILO reports that were mentioned. It was extremely important for us as a community to be able to respond to the findings of those reports. As we know, while the bank and the fund may disagree with the extent of it, they don't deny the flaws in the targeting of social provision, right? But their opposition to universal social protection really is focused on the affordability of it. So in that way, I think this very methodologically robust research really will play an important role in our ability to engage with the fund and the bank on substantive discussions, and also, of course, with ministries of finance and treasuries, and to impact country-level programs. And also, the other thing that I like about this, and particularly given the tool, I think this report and the tool really should enable local or national civil society and other communities to engage in discussions with their own governments as the governments themselves then engage with the IMF and the World Bank in different program designs. So I think this is a great report. In that way, I think tactically and strategically, unfortunately, as I think many of you would know, the centering discussions with the World Bank and IMF on the issues of human rights, etc., is not normally met with particularly effective results. So I think having a very concrete, costed proposal is great. I don't want to take too much more time, But I think the provision of benchmarking with other countries' experience also very politically intelligent, because it demonstrates to decision makers that this is possible. It's a pragmatic approach that enables countries to see that these things can be achieved without, it's rational and reasonable. And then I'd like to just bring one other issue to the table, which is I was very, very happy to hear Stephen and the paper talk about the social contract. One of the things that, if you're following the dynamics of economic outlooks, etc., you know that the World Bank and the IMF, the UN system, even the Financial Times and others, pardon me, are very, very concerned about social and political instability and the impacts these instabilities have on the economic systems and outcomes. And so, it's a very strong argument to say that this type of system, and which is affordable, can also support efforts to strengthen support for multilateral systems and state institutions. So I think this is a very, very important part of the emphasis of the report also. And finally, I think it'd be interesting, maybe a task for a follow-up, to consider the economic multiplier effects of what's being proposed. Because if you look, for example, the support for pensions, and then the impact of this proposal on the care responsibilities of people who are in the labor market or have to exit the labor market, in order to care. I think it'd be interesting to see to also explore the positive multiplier effects of this policy proposal. So I hope that this was a useful, some thoughts and considerations for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. And you mentioned also the discussion on the social contract, and I can also just then mention that Act Church of Sweden and Development Pathways did publish a report specifically on that issue, going deeper into that. But from this global debate perspective that you presented, we will now turn to the national level. So I will invite Firas Sakraoui to give your comments. And Firas, you're a Tunisian civil society activist and human rights advocate, currently serving as programs manager at Al Bawsala. And Al Bawsala, I'm sure I didn't pronounce it right, means compass. And it's a civil society organization in Tunisia working on democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And you hold a master's degree in tax law and previously led the public finance and public policies program you do that now at Al Bawsala, and before that you headed the tax justice and public finances project at the Tunisian Observatory of the Economy. So please share your comments on the report and the online tool, and how useful do you find them in the national context? Please.
Yeah, thank you, Gunnel. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to join this discussion today. So I would like to share some reflections on the methodological choices in the report, and then discuss how this approach can inform debates in Tunisia, where questions around the cost of social protection remain extremely prominent. Let me begin with the methodology, which I think is one of the strongest contributions of this study. First, the choice to use median benefit levels expressed as a percentage of GDP per capita rather than poverty lines is both pragmatic and politically realistic. Poverty lines vary widely, they are often outdated, and they do not always reflect living standards or fiscal capacity. So using median international benchmarks avoids these inconsistencies and produces estimates that are comparable, grounded in real experience, and credible for policymakers. Of course, as the authors note, the median benefit level levels used in the paper are simply a common benchmark for international comparison. They are not a proposed national standard, and the online tool allows countries, including Tunisia, to explore whichever benefit values best match their own priorities and fiscal realities. Second, the report rightly emphasizes progressive realization. So no country has built a universal system overnight. Everywhere from Europe to Latin America, social security systems were developed incrementally over decades. Yet many costing exercises today assume immediate fully universal rollout, which inflates cost estimates and reinforces the idea that universality is unaffordable. By modeling a 20-year phased expansion, this study offers more realistic picture of how policymaking actually occurs. Third, the decision to model universal benefits rather than targeted schemes is crucial. Targeting has long been promoted as cost effective, yet in practice it produces high exclusion errors, administrative complexity, and social stigma. So universal benefits such as universal pension or universal child allowance are simpler, more transparent, and more politically resilient also. In contexts with a fragile social contracts, this matters greatly. And finally, moving away from pessimistic costing, such as ILO estimates suggesting financing gaps close to 20% of GDP is essential. So this study shows that if countries expand gradually, the real additional financing required is closer to 1 to 3% of GDP, not 20%. So this difference is not just technical, it reshapes what is politically imaginable. So now for Tunisia and why this methodology is useful. Tunisia has a long tradition of social protection, contributory pensions, school allowances, cash transfers, and subsidies. But the system is fragmented, unequal, and only partially effective. And every reform debate begins usually by the same phrase: we cannot afford it. So I see three ways in which this report can help shift the conversation. First, Tunisia is trapped in a narrative of unaffordability. Whether the topic is pensions, amende sociale, or subsidies, the starting assumptions is always fiscal impossibility, an assumption reinforced by both international institutions and domestic actors. So this report provides a much needed counter narrative. Universal systems do not require unaffordable spending and gradual increases aligned with economic realities. So they are feasible even in a constrained context. Second, Tunisia already has building blocks for universal life cycle system. So we have contributory pensions, student support, and the PNAFN and amende sociale programs reaching nearly 1 million households. But these schemes are not harmonized and are not built into a life cycle logic. So the methodology in the report helps us imagine how to reorganize these elements currently. So, for example, introducing universal child benefit at a modest level to replace fragmented allowances, establishing a universal basic pension for older adults outside contributory system, or even introducing a caregiver or a disability benefit to support families currently relying on informal mechanisms. The report offers also a realistic financing pathway. Tunisia is often told to reform before expanding, but the study shows that with a small annual increases, about 0.1% of GDP per year, Tunisia could progressively build a universal system over 20 years. So this gradual approach is essential in a country where abrupt adjustments often trigger social tensions. The report also has implications, I think, for the global debate. Institutions like the IMF and the World Bank often promote narrowly targeted schemes for cost reasons. But this study demonstrates that universal systems rolled out progressively are not significantly more expensive, and they perform better while generating greater political support. So this evidence strengthens the hand of countries like Tunisia in policy dialogues with international partners. For coming to the online tool now, the online tool accompanying the report, I think that it's extremely valuable and it allows ministries, researchers, and civil society to simulate country-specific scenarios, adjusting benefit levels, age thresholds, rollout periods, and growth assumptions. So for Tunisia, it provides a credible way to design and communicate reform proposals. I also want to highlight 4 weaknesses, maybe in the report, that become especially relevant when applying the methodology to Tunisia. First, administrative and political constraints. Tunisia faces deep institutional fragmentation, multiple registries that do not communicate, legacy IT systems in social security institutions, and uneven digitalization between regions. So these factors increase administrative costs, slow rollout, and create risks of exclusion. Politically, overlapping mandates, austerity logic, and weak interministerial coordination complicate any reform. Without incorporating these political economy realities, the feasibility model becomes overly optimistic. Second, the assumption of 100% take-up. The modeling assumes everyone eligible receives the benefit. This is, I think, unrealistic, especially in a country where informality exceeds 50% and the trust in state institutions is uneven. Women's low labor force participation and regional disparities further reduce real take-up. So this means the model may overestimate both cost and impact. Third, reliance on optimistic GDP growth assumptions. So using IMF projections is the standard, but Tunisia's growth is volatile and vulnerable to political instability, climate shocks, tourist cycles, and external financing constraints. Even small deviations in growth, 0.5 percentage point, could significantly shift affordability over 20 years. Any roadmap must account for this uncertainty. Fourth, the disability prevalence assumption. The report uses a flat 3% disability rate. For Tunisia, this is inaccurate. Our aging population and high rates of chronic disease mean actual prevalence is higher and uneven across regions. So underestimating disability prevalence risks under budgeting and missing critical equity concerns. These 4 limitations do not undermine the value of the report, but they do remind us that costed scenarios cannot be transferred mechanically to Tunisia. Universal right-based system is possible and desirable, but its feasibility depends on acknowledging administrative constraints, moderating coverage assumptions, integrating macroeconomic uncertainty, and accurately sizing demographic needs. So, bringing these elements into the debate will help ensure that any future roadmap for Tunisia is not only ambitious and rights-based, but also realistic and grounded in institutional realities. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and also for highlighting the importance of the assumptions and talking about, like Louise highlighted, an idea for further research. I think the costs of administration, which we also know are larger for more targeted systems, is that could actually be also an issue for further research. But before we open up for open questions and discussions, Stephen, would you like to comment on any of Fira's points that he mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, and Luisa, very, very briefly, because I think we want to see if we can get to questions. I mean, I think, Luisa's points are really, really important. I think it's important to recognize that the World Bank and IMF are still promoting within the social security area structural adjustment, the Washington Consensus, all that they set out in 1990, etc. It's the same old, failed every time since then. It's going to continue to fail, and we have to ask, why are you still proposing something that you set out in the 1990s in such a different age, right? Do something different, right? Get behind it and see that it is possible to do this. Problem is, you may not be able to tie a loan to it, so you may reduce your incentive for a universal benefit because nobody's going to take a loan for a universal benefit. I think the point of Luis as well on the multipliers. I think, of course, if you do build these universal systems, you get multiplier, you get much more economic growth. That'll actually make it cheaper in the long term than we've costed out, because you could help generate much more economic growth. And I think thanks to Firas, I think I think take the points of the tool though, while we can assume coverage 100%, etc., the tool allows you to adjust things like coverage. If you think the economic growth rates are too optimistic, you can adjust that. You can bring them down. You can bring them up if you think they're too pessimistic. Disability benefits, again, you can adjust the coverage for each age group within that. So we've just set 1% and 3%, which is basically based on the coverage that you get of pretty good disability benefits in low and middle income countries. Very few countries reach that. I just point out, the 3% is only for working age adults. It's not for old age, where you would get the old age pension. So I'll stop there, but I'd like to thank them both for some very helpful and interesting comments.
Thank you. And we've seen that there are some questions in the Q&A box, which Stephen have already responded. So if there is anyone who has a question or a comment who would like to raise your hand, and please do so. I'm not sure I can see if there are. And then your microphone would be, while people are thinking of, maybe then I could call on Stephen to maybe, first I can say that there has been questions about this ILO figure of almost 20%, and there is a paper that Development Pathways wrote about this, and then a response back. So I don't think we need to discuss on that. You have already got the link to that. But there were other questions on, let's see. I think there was someone about, Pierre de Bosbo, I can't pronounce, but about why not using the benefit test, I think maybe. And there's also the issue of relation to the contributory system. We are now talking about the tax, but maybe you would like to say something about those issues, which I personally found interesting as well.
On the benefit testing element, I think we did sort of consider doing that. We often propose this actually in some of our work, but there are challenges. with benefit testing of, say, the pension, which for those who don't know, it's where you withdraw the tax finance benefit from those who contributing into the contributory system. One, it penalizes those in the formal economy. They pay their taxes and then they don't receive the benefits. So that's going to undermine political support for the benefits. So giving a flat benefit to everybody, including all taxpayers, on the recognition that you get it because you paid tax, and everybody pays tax, including from sale taxes. It seems a lot fairer and will build more political support. Benefit testing, when done badly, undermines the contributory system because you may, if it doesn't have a very good tapering rate or a generous tapering rate, then you may decide not to contribute in because you can get the tax finance benefit. So it can undermine the contributory system. And also in our targeting paper that we did, we looked at some countries that have benefit testing, and there's still very large coverage gaps, which you don't get in countries that provide a flat rate universal benefit. So good example is Mexico, which went from trying to have benefit testing for its pension and then decided on a universal pension. So that's the means. We explain that in the paper, but it is an option, reduces the cost, but probably at the cost of political support and effectiveness.
Okay, and then I see a dialogue between Marcus Manuel and yourself about, we have been talking here about the pragmatic choice of using existing levels of benefits as the benchmark, whereas others have used the poverty lines in different ways. Maybe you could share some of that. I think that's interesting for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think the poverty. I mean, I think Firas already took up the issue of poverty line. Poverty lines are somewhat fictitious things anyway. You can have poverty line can be whatever you want. Countries have different measures, different ways, different assumptions that go into poverty lines. Poverty lines should be used as a way of measuring. It's just a tool for measuring progress in a country. It's never a tool for determining what is social policy, right? It should never be done in that way. So that's one for not using the poverty lines. I think in terms of Marcus's question on how much our values relate to poverty lines in low-income countries, I think it probably in some countries won't reach the poverty line, and some it probably does for the individual, but we haven't actually looked at that. We can look at that, but the point is that these are realistic benefit levels that all countries could be able to do based on the median, and in many countries they're much more generous than is already provided. Just to give an example of Uganda, which has a universal old age pension, which we were very much involved in. It's lost value over so many of the years. We're proposing something that'd be about 3 times as high as what is actually given. And actually what is actually given, which is much lower, still makes a big difference to people's lives. But we're saying you could do something much more generous, still at relatively low cost. So we could look at that, but I just wouldn't get obsessed with poverty lines given the sort of arbitrary nature. But they're great for measuring progress, right? In countries, if that's all you want to do, but they just have to be consistent.
Okay, thank you. And still no one, don't be shy. Yes, Louise, good. You raise your hand.
Yes. How's my audio? It's okay?
Fine. It's okay.
Okay, great. Actually, I have a question. Have you had a chance to discuss the report with any of the ministers of finance, or have you discussed the outcome of the report with any government officials? And I'd like to know what the responses have been, if any.
Well, thanks, Luis. The specific report, no, but the methodology that we've used here, sort of growing over time and setting things, yes, we've done that many, many times in many countries. And I think what you find is that in many examples, policymakers have never had this explained to them, that universal social security is possible and feasible. And when they do, they suddenly think, wow, why are we not doing it, right? And they've sort of been blocked because they've been given these false messages. So this methodology, yes, we've used in a lot of countries, and it's got a lot of support in terms of doing it, because it just shows that it's actually reasonable to build a universal system. The problem is that in many countries we work in, of course, there's the countervailing forces of the IMF and the World Bank that push back a lot. And I mean, the most egregious case is, poor Mongolia, which has the best system around the world. The IMF and the World Bank are still attacking them, saying they can't afford it, despite a fantastic economy. They're paying off their debt, and they have all these universal benefits, and they're still told you can't afford these. You have to cut them. You have to you have to poverty target the benefits, and it's really an assault on national sovereignty, really, and often, and even worse when they threaten to withdraw loans at the moment, which they can't do at the moment because the Mongolian economy is doing really well. But once it has a little bit of a problem and they need a loan, then I'm sure we'll find the more bullying that happens there again as well.
Maybe on that, I can also add that the previous paper where you were calculating the cost for 4 different countries with different demographic profiles, but also added the effects on poverty on that. We had a session with staff experts from both the World Bank and IMF. And if I recall, I think the critique they had on the methodology there was more on the effects on poverty than actually the costing. But it will be interesting to have to use this paper also to get input and reactions from World Bank, IMF, and of course national governments. Right, and no other questions. Firas, is there anything else you would like to add, or Danisha? Then I think we have come to the point where the final poll question. So you, or actually, could we see the response from the poll we had? Yes, I see it here on my personal screen. So the result, what you believed before, was that around 2 to 5% of GDP and there was low income countries. That was actually no, it was less than 2%, right? For low income countries is one. So that means only 22% of participants thought that it would be less than 2% for low income countries. Am I right, Stephen?
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah. So most of you thought that would be either more than 10% or 2 to 5%. So that means that before you enter this, you thought that it would be higher than these calculations show. And looking at middle-income countries, most would say around 2 to 5%, which is true actually, because for middle-income countries it was slightly higher. Now, the final question that I would like you to respond to is whether you find the report's conclusion that universal social security is financially achievable in both low and middle income countries. So please answer the poll that you will see on your screen now. So now let's see. Well, it seems that you've done a good job, Stephen. Most think that it's very convincing or somewhat convincing, and there's one person who is bewildered, who is confused, I guess, and don't know. But I think this is a good start. And before closing this seminar, and actually you will have 3 minutes off, so we close before, just to encourage you to look at the paper, read it, and moreover, use the tool and play around with it. See whether the suggested transfer levels for the 15 or 30% of GDP per capita, whether that's in your particular context, is that reasonable as a first step? Is it adequate even? And this idea of gradual introduction, how relevant is that in your context? So use it, play it, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And congratulations
too.
on a great report again.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Wow.
Thank you.
bye-bye.